I used to think that the old adage of Rome wasn't built in a day was painfully obvious and also distinctly uninsightful, because honestly, at face value, it kind of is. That phrase is winking at you so hard it's practically wearing an eye patch. But if instead of just Rome the city, we think about Rome the culture, Rome the institution, Rome the sea-conquering empire, that phrase starts to actually say something. Rome, as I hope this video series will show, was really special. There's honestly nothing like it. And I think it's important to appreciate not just what Rome became, but how much slow, careful, calculated effort was put into its creation. And as you'll see in a minute, early Roman history is a notoriously slow burn. Generation after generation dedicated themselves to something they'd never see the end of, and I just think that's really cool. So, let's do some history. If we jump into our handy-dandy time machines and go all the way back to the beginning of Roman history, we'll be looking at an actively on-fire city, which happens to be Troy. Yep. The plot twist is that the Romans are actually descendants of the Trojans. According to Roman tradition, one specific Trojan, named Aeneas, who fled the burning city on the orders of his mother Venus to sail around the Mediterranean in search of Italy. This story comes to us most clearly in Virgil's epic poem The Aeneid, which you can see read summarized over here. After a run-in with Queen Dido of Carthage and a journey through scenic hell, Aeneas and crew arrived on the plain of Latium in central Italy. To make matters more Italian, the very first thing they do when they arrive is eat pizza. Wow. We're not even 2 minutes in, and we're already establishing over 3,000 years of stereotypes. I can't even be mad, that's just really efficient. Fast forward a few hundred years after Aeneas to 753 BC, and the brothers Romulus and Remus, who were raised by a wolf, got into a kerfuffle of sorts while building some walls around their village, and Romulus ended up murdering Remus in what became the most etymologically significant fratricide in world history. That, kids, is why it's called Rome and not Rheme. Anyway, Romulus claimed kingship over his newly walled village, and over the next 2.5 centuries, 7 kings oversaw Rome's transformation from backwater town to moderately cool city. And even that wasn't a guarantee. Most of the action in world history up to this point happened in Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean. Rome is all the way on the west coast of Italy. I don't think I can overstate how completely irrelevant Rome was in the broader Mediterranean arena for the first 500 years of its history. Rome, as we know, ended up conquering most of the known classical world, but a majority of its early history was simply a spirited back and forth between its neighbors. The Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the south, and later on, the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia to the way further south. And by spirited, I do literally mean they were stabbing each other with spears. While all of this neighborly murdery business was going on, the city of Rome was building itself up both physically and institutionally, with walls, streets, a sewer system, stone temples and buildings, a governmental system reminiscent of the Greek polis system, and a religious system reminiscent of the Greek pantheon. Man, that Greek influence really got in there early. All of this was going on all nice and well until, in 509 BC, the Romans thought that their king, Tarquin the Proud, aka Tarquinius Superbus, aka Tarquitarch Superbus, was a total knob. And they were getting kinda tired of being ruled, so they kicked him out, swore never to have another king again, and officially created the Roman Republic. Institutionally speaking, a lot of the mechanics of the Republic were already in place, like the Senate, the patrician nobility, and the citizen assembly, for instance. The transition to a republic was really more of a reorganization of authority than a political revolution or anything like that. Broadly speaking, the whole idea was to take their government and publicize the power so the people could participate. And the word republic comes from the Latin res publica, which just means public thing. Structurally, the government was controlled by 2 annually elected consuls. The praetors ran the justice system, and the quaestors, the silliest Roman name ever, managed state finances. The aediles were responsible for the state of the city, so they handled food, games, infrastructure, and all that jazz. The Senate, though it didn't directly legislate anything, published opinions on policy that were often very quickly put in place by the respective officers down the chain. Almost all of these magistrates and senators in the early republic were of the patrician nobility. If you happened to be one of Rome's many plebeians, you might have rightly felt a little left out of this supposed res publica. The plebeians, unsurprisingly, wanted political and social rights, and they were determined to acquire them. So on any given season of campaigning against Rome's bothersome neighbors, the plebeians, who composed the majority of the army, simply went on strike. They'd just go sit on a hill and wait until the Senate granted them the right to marry patricians, or to have their own government positions in special assembly, or to elect their own members of that special assembly, or to serve as consul, and then by 287 BC, the plebeians and the patricians were equal in everything but name. Good for them. Institutionally, the Roman Republic simultaneously had elements of a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. This mixed constitution and its flexibility in governance, according to the historian Polybius, was one of Rome's greatest strengths, and I'm inclined to agree. Rome's institutions were its backbone for over 1,000 years, and that's darn impressive. Okay, enough of the politicky stuff. Back to the stabby stuff. Now, like I said, early Roman Republican history is a notoriously slow burn. The struggle for plebeians' rights took over 2 centuries, and conquering the Italian peninsula was similarly slow going. Rome was intent on being careful, taking small steps, and taking its time. Recall how, in the aftermath of both the Macedonian and Mongol conquests, when you go too far, too fast, things tend to fracture. Rome spent most of the 4th and early 3rd centuries fighting with various neighbors and working its way down to only the Bay of Naples. That's a pretty short way to go in so long a time. They were being really careful. Key to Rome's military strategy was the doctrine of expanding defense. Essentially, Rome would never be so brash as to go out and attack someone. Good heavens no. Rome had the good manners to only fight in self-defense, and they knew that their gods would only grant them victory if their war was a just and pious war. But if Rome suspected that someone was going to attack them, Rome would absolutely shoot first. Defensively, of course. A preemptive retaliatory strike, if you will. And that is how you go on to conquer the entire world defensively. By 280, Rome had successfully yoinked all of Samnium and proceeded to set its sights on Magna Graecia in southern Italy. Magna Graecia, not being the biggest fans of the Romans and wishing to keep their land thank you very much, sent for help from Greece proper, and they brought in the big guns. Specifically, they imported the Hellenistic king Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus fought 2 battles against the Romans, and even though he won both of them, his losses were so devastating that he bailed on the campaign. After a detour through Sicily, he fought the Romans again, lost, and went home for good. Pyrrhus' abilities to win battles, coupled with his inability to not burn through a third of his army in the process, is what gives us the term Pyrrhic victory. So, good on Pyrrhus for eternally tethering his name to the military equivalent of pulling 5 consecutive all-nighters to cram for a test. Yeah, it's a win, but was it worth it? So with pretty much no one left to protect Magna Graecia, Rome proceeded to swoop in and colonize all over the place. And unlike those who employ the torch it and start over method of conquest, the Romans had a good track record of being kind to conquered peoples. Except for this next example, from a rather salty chapter in Roman history, the Punic Wars against Carthage. Okay, so for the purposes of keeping this video under 20 minutes long, I'm actually going to breeze through it here, but check out this additional video for the full rundown. Basically, Rome and Carthage stumbled into the First War because of a mix-up in Sicily and proceeded to spend the following 23 years not actually fighting all that much. In order to fight the seafaring Carthaginians, the Romans needed to construct a fleet from scratch, so it was a fairly slow process. After the Romans won the uneventful First War, they annexed Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia and levied an indemnity on Carthage. Understandably miffed, Carthage swore revenge against Rome, and in 218 the general Hannibal crossed the Alps with his army, and proceeded to make a mess of Italy for 16 years. Things were looking pretty dire for the Romans. In 211, a campaign by the young Scipio drove the Carthaginians out of Spain, and he then proceeded to attack Carthage directly, ultimately defeating Hannibal and winning the war. Finally, half a century later, Rome returns to absolutely destroy Carthage. There was enough salt rubbed into that earth to season a titan. And to freely admit my historical bias, I will say that I absolutely love Carthaginian salt memes. With Spain and North Africa now happily Romanized, focus shifted eastward, and Rome proceeded to clean up the squabbling and stagnating Hellenistic kingdoms from the aftermath of Alexander the Short-Sighted's campaigns. The Macedonians had helped Carthage in the Punic Wars, and Rome considered that sufficient grounds for bespearment. And bespearment, of course, is a word that I made up for the act of getting stabbed with a spear. Anyway, in that conflict, the Seleucid Greeks helped the Macedonians, so the Romans saw that too as provocation. Not wanting to go too far too fast, and also because they didn't quite have a big enough army yet, Rome stopped at Greece for the better part of a century and simply took to kneecapping the armies of the Eastern Mediterranean, so they didn't pose any direct threat. This marks a much more aggressive Roman attitude towards conquest. It was super important that Italy be unified through kindness and generosity, because that was Italy, but all of these new places were explicitly considered provinces under Rome. Even though Rome was still a republic and didn't yet have an emperor, it absolutely possessed an empire by this point. After the conquest of Greece and the acquisition of the kingdom of Pergamum through a will, of all things, Rome was clearly the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Now, despite Rome's best efforts, it was about to have some serious problems, a few of which derived from the Roman patron-client system, in which a wealthy and well-connected Roman provided for his clients, who in turn supported him politically. This worked fine on a small scale, but things got problematic when people effectively tried to buy public support in large quantities. In the late 2nd century, the Gracchi brothers attempted on several occasions to redistribute land to their supporters, among several other reforms, and when Tiberius Gracchus tried to run for re-election as tribune, he was assassinated. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus and his allies were also assassinated. Whoa, Rome buddy, hold up. You had no political violence for over 600 years, you got a really good thing going. Please don't screw this up. Oh wow, yeah, they really screw this one up, don't they? Jeez. Yikes, where do we start? Okay, so, first, there are 3 mass slave revolts in Sicily and Italy. Then there's the Social War, where most of Italy revolted against Rome, after which all Italians were granted full citizenship. And let's also not forget the Catiline conspiracy to overthrow the consulship of Cicero. All of those civil wars were reconciled, but still, that's a lot of civil warring to happen in just the span of a half-century. But by far, the worst of the lot were the factional civil wars between the populist populares and the aristocratic optimates, otherwise known as the 2 civil wars between Marius and Sulla. Gaius Marius, a 7-time consul and general who conquered parts of North Africa and settled the Social War, headed the populares, while the optimates were led by Lucius Sulla, another successful general. The optimates were the ones who assassinated the Gracchi brothers, and when Sulla came back from a campaign in Anatolia, he marched his army into Rome, established himself as dictator, and proceeded to massacre his rival populares. Twice. He did all of that twice. That's huge! In 50 years, we went from not a single Roman being killed over politics to armies marching on Rome and carrying out prescribed hit lists of political enemies. Things were really, really bad in the 1st century. But we're not going to topple the Republic until the next video, so stay tuned. For now though, let's recap. Rome started as one tiny, irrelevant city and grew itself very gradually through calculated means. First conquering Italy, then the islands, then Spain, and soon after Greece, North Africa, and Anatolia. What astounds me is that a typical Roman would only ever see a small part of this unfold. The Romans were patient, and they knew that doing things properly and working towards something bigger than themselves would lead to accomplishments far greater and longer lasting than the floundering conquests of a Greek kid on a horse.